that brings us to time banks, which is what I'll be focusing on for the remainder of the period this evening here. Time banks are a much more flexible model of local currency. They can be based in the community, or they can be based in institutions or organizations. And so the benefit of the time bank model is indeed its flexibility. These are often administered by paid staff, particularly the early time banks. What we see now as the movement has grown is that the majority of these now are actually run by volunteers. And so I'll talk some more about those implications as well. The time bank model is one that is highly egalitarian in that each service earns the very same credit. So one person's hour is worth any other person's hour in the system. And so that has some implications, but it is different very much so than pegging it to the dollar, and that you are tracking time, and it's highly egalitarian, and some people have a problem with that. The currency is known as time dollars or hours, and they are tracked in a database, electronic database. And that turns out to be a major advantage in that administrators are easily able to see what's happening within the network. Debt is usually allowed in time banks. Different time banks have different policies on this, but most do allow participants to run into debt, which is a unique feature. In Ithaca Hours, you can take out a loan, fill out the paperwork, and actually get an Ithaca Hours loan. In time banking, it's much more loose in general, and debt is usually allowed, and in some cases even encouraged. There's a tax-exempt ruling that Edgar Kahn was able to get from the IRS back in the early 1980s surrounding this concept. And so it's a really nice thing that time banking is tax-exempt. These networks are fairly regulated. There is an application process, and there's an active role in the office. We see it continues to be the fastest growing form globally, and that through our research, we have identified 130 of these systems presently in the United States. There's around 100 in the UK, and that's actually down a little bit from where it was. So in our best guess, the number of time banks is growing in the United States and shrinking just a little bit in the UK. So when we think about the geographical dispersion of time banks, and if we look at a map, we'll see that it is not random, that these systems are not randomly found throughout the country. This is essentially a set of data here from our respondents to a national coordinator survey of those 130 time banks that we identified in the United States. 97 of them were generous enough to share their time with us and take our survey. And this is very similar to what I found with the case of the hour systems, is that we tend to find these networks in more liberal places. A lot of these are college towns. You'll notice a coastal phenomenon there. So these things do not just randomly pop up, but there are some interesting cases of where these things are. I want to talk quickly about some of the challenges. So when I inundate you with data, you'll keep this in mind, and I'll come back to these at the end a little bit. And these are challenges that I've found through research in this area, and some of these have been found by other people as well, and some of them we're just learning about now, but they all seem, we're in agreement that they all seem to make sense, and they're things that people need to be aware of. So the administration of these systems are it's not easy. They require considerable resources to launch, that is to start, and to maintain. So there's major labor time required to both start, particularly to start, and then to maintain these systems. There are expenses, there are cash expenses that all of these networks incur, and there's considerable overhead in some of these organizations. Monitoring can be difficult in these systems, particularly in the case of the hours systems. It's in fact impossible, that they have no idea how those printed bills are circulating or whether they are. So, people trade those things all the time, or they don't. They might sit in people's wallets, and so that's a disadvantage of the hours model, is that monitoring can be difficult. And we find, too, that some join these networks and are basically not very active at all. And so it is important to monitor these networks, and the community currency coordinators I've talked with across the country all recognize this as an issue about really facilitating and encouraging exchanges to keep the systems active. So recruitment challenges is that it is a difficult concept to sell, in that particularly the hours systems coordinators that I talked to several years ago now really talked about the struggle with trying to, showing people this funny money, this printed currency, and trying to explain how this actually works. And a lot of people just don't buy it. And here in my classes, I always talk about this, and there's inevitably students that have a problem. They can't believe it. It sounds too good to be true. How could that possibly work? A lot of people assume that as economic actors, we are rational, and that there would be a way to manipulate and rip off these systems and so forth. And what we find is that that's actually very rare. But still, it's a difficult concept to sell, particularly to businesses, as you might imagine. And business participation really helps, as well as having nonprofits. The framing is very important, how people frame these projects when they are starting them up. Some people frame them in a very political manner, and that often really targets the participants in that I talked to several coordinators that said a lot of people wouldn't join because they perceived this as some green progressive thing, and they thought it was some special interest group or something. Edgar Kahn, I've had conversations with him about this, and what he has been brilliant in not allowing time banking to be framed from a political angle, and so he's always stressed the community building angle much more than the political angle. And because some people have come at this as an alternative to capitalism, and that's what originally sparked my interest in it. And if you come at it and frame these projects very politically, then it certainly impacts recruitment. So that's another challenge that people face. The methods as well, we learned that recruitment is primarily by word of mouth. And word of mouth recruitment has its limits, and it eventually begins to taper off. And so that's an ongoing challenge for local currencies. Participation challenges, it definitely takes more effort than walking into a store to buy something. You have to log in and look in the directory and make phone calls and connect with someone and negotiate this transaction. And it requires trust. And a lot of trust is built by participation in this, but to get people to join and to start off, trust is required. What we find is that some participants in these struggle to request. That is, they struggle to consume in these networks and to purchase things. They're very happy to give, okay? And it is, in many cases, easier to give than to receive. And we find that here, and that some members almost refuse to receive services and insist only on giving. So that's a struggle as well. And supply and demand issues can be an issue depending on who is in the network and the type of services that are in high demand. Longevity, what we have found in this country, particularly with the hours case, is that most do not last more than 5 years. We're working on this for the time banking case as well. It's a little bit less clear at this point. But the longevity, particularly in the printed currencies, the hour system, is not there, and that the majority of these systems do not last more than 5 years when I did that research. So let me talk about the three cases that we're focusing on in this book. I recruited Judy Lasker, who had been doing research in Allentown, Pennsylvania, with a time bank known as Community Exchange, and I recruited Corinne Karaku, who had been working in Brooklyn with a time bank known as Member to Member, one of the first time banks in the country, founded in 1987. And so what I quickly realized is that given the flexibility of the models, there are major different types of time banks. And so we distinguish these between community-based, that is those that are started essentially by activists and that are rooted in communities at large, versus those that are institution-based or organization-based. And so many time banks, as we see, are indeed housed in organizations or institutions such as churches, social service agencies, Community Exchange is housed in a hospital in Allentown. Member to Member is part of a health maintenance organization in Brooklyn. And so there are some advantages to being based in existing organizations. And some time banks have open memberships, that is, anybody can join, such as the case of Our Exchange Portland here in Maine, as well as Community Exchange. Others have restricted memberships, such as Member to Member, and that program is particularly targeted and continues to be toward elderly participants and trying to help them maintain independence. So there are a number of different models in time banks, and so this is something we consider throughout. These systems were not chosen randomly. I live here in Portland, and so I remember the day I was driving down Cumberland Avenue and saw the sign for the Maine Time Dollar Network, and it was I remember pulling over and talking to Robin Lakin, and it was just this light bulb went off about, wow, I'd read about these things, and I never thought that they would have a standalone office, let alone seeing this big banner out front. I vividly remember that, and that's when this all started from that day, really. But so Our Exchange Portland, as Richard mentioned, has a long history, dating back to the mid-1990s, and the official launch of the full exchange happened in 1998. Community Exchange started their exchanges officially in 2000. Oftentimes these take, in some cases, a couple of years to really start these things, depending on trial and error. And Member, as I mentioned, was started in 1987. So those are the three cases that we focused on in this book, in this research. And so here are the major research questions that we're pursuing. First of all, we think about demographics and who joins time banks. Next, we consider motivations, and that is, why do people join? Then we look at any possible association between demographics and motivations, and that are different people joining for different types of reasons, and we would expect they would. We look at the transactions, of course, what is being traded within these networks. So the form of participation, how many people are active, and how often are they exchanging, what types of services are being exchanged in these networks. Do members maintain balanced accounts or not? This is a common question. Do demographics impact participation? And who trades with whom is another one that we look at to see the bridging or bonding ties. So we'll be able to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, we explore outcomes. What do participants gain by joining time banks? Do demographics impact these outcomes? Do the outcomes match the motivations? That is, are people gaining what they originally sought out when they joined? And how does participation shape these outcomes? So these are the major research questions. You can read about them in great detail, hopefully by next year. The data collected are numerous. This has been by far the most challenging project I've ever attempted. And the major source of data include the National Coordinator Survey I've mentioned, membership surveys, cross-sectional at both Our Exchange Portland and Community Exchange. We have longitudinal surveys at the member-to-member case with control groups of participants and non-participants, some quasi-experimental data. We have transaction records from both the HEP and CE cases covering a 12.5-year period from Our Exchange Portland from 1998 to mid-2010. So I cut it off at June 30th of last year. The data literally are coming in as we speak. You know, every single day, an average of 21 hours are being traded in Our Exchange Portland. And so I had to cut it off at one point and try to analyze this stuff. So I did the cutoff at Community Exchange at the same, so 10.5 years of transaction records. We've done a number of different interviews and some focus groups as well as part of this project.